November 12, 1943, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The frost came early that year. Along the Potomac, a low mist rolled over the proving grounds as a handful of officers and ordnance engineers gathered in silence. They were watching a new kind of gun, one that did not kick. Lieutenant Harold Briggs, 27, son of a machinist from Toledo, leaned forward in disbelief as the first M18 recoilless rifle fired. The sound was sharp but clean, the weapon barely moved, and a white trail streaked toward a derelict Sherman hull 600 yards downrange. When the smoke cleared, a ragged hole gaped through both sides of the turret. 70 pounds, said Captain R.P. Myers of the Ordnance Department, noting the data in his field book. A man can carry it like a roll of fencing wire, and it punches like a 57. The test officers said little else. They knew what the numbers meant. For 3 years, the U.S. Army had relied on the M1 bazooka, light, simple, and increasingly obsolete. German tanks had grown thicker hides since Tunisia, and the panzers that prowled Italy could shrug off the old rocket's 2.36-inch warhead. Infantry needed something else, something longer-reaching, faster, more certain. The new gun had begun as an experiment in the ballistics research laboratory, born from the obscure idea that backblast could neutralize recoil. By venting propellant gases rearward, the weapon could remain featherlight while hurling a full-sized projectile. The concept wasn't American by birth, the British had tinkered with it, but Lockheed's Ordnance Division refined the process with remarkable speed. The result was officially designated the 57mm Recoilless rifle, M18. Records from the U.S. National Archives show the first 20 test units delivered to Fort Belvoir in late autumn 1943. A handful were shipped to Camp Hood and the Marine Training Grounds in Quantico for preliminary field evaluation. Reports returned within weeks, accuracy exceptional. Penetration beyond expectation. Handling superior to rocket-type launchers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At the same time, across the Atlantic, German engineers at Hugo Schneider AG were issuing new batches of Panzerfaust 30 and 60 models, cheap, disposable launchers with blistering short-range power. They could stop a Sherman at 80 yards, but their users often paid with their lives. The Reich's infantry was bound to the close-range ambush, while American ordnance men were already thinking in terms of distance. In one of the surviving memos from Brigadier General Gladion M. Barnes, the Army's chief of ordnance, he wrote, "If the German Panzerfaust is the dagger, the recoilless rifle must become the lance. It will allow the rifleman to strike without suicide." Back at Fort Belvoir, test crews fired until the barrels glowed dull red. They noted that the M18's backblast could kill a man standing too near, that its report gave away position, that its ammunition, heat and heat, had to be kept dry. But none of those problems seemed disqualifying. The promise was too clear. A weapon that could be broken down into parts, carried by 2 men, and knock out armor from nearly 900 yards changed the entire arithmetic of infantry survival. By December, the Office of the Chief of Ordnance authorized limited production at the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. It was a modest start, barely 1,200 rifles ordered, but the Army moved quietly. There would be no press release, no publicity photographs. Even within the service, the new gun's existence was restricted information. In the correspondence of Colonel Leslie Skinner, head of the infantry board, he described the first M18 detachment sent for combat evaluation, for men trained at Belvoir, to be attached to field units under highest discretion. If captured, deny the weapon's principle. No one at the time could have imagined that this anonymous tube of steel would one day make German armor officers rewrite their tactics. In November 1943, it was just another number in the Ordnance Ledger, a portable 57mm device for anti-tank and general support use. But as Captain Myers looked downrange that cold morning, at the still-smoking hole in the Sherman's turret, he wrote something else in the margin of his notebook: no recoil. Full penetration. Infantry has its own artillery now. Outside, the frost began to melt on the barrels, and the dawn over Virginia turned the smoke into gold. The first recoilless rifle had spoken. Few heard it, but history did. May 17, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. The jungle was not kind to steel. Humidity chewed at barrels, mud swallowed tripods, and men learned to fight with what they could carry. On the beaches of Saipan, among the wreckage of amphibious tractors and the shattered palms, the M18 Recoilless rifle entered combat for the first time. Sergeant Tom Harkins of the 23rd Marine Regiment remembered the moment in his debriefing report. It looked too light to do anything serious. Then we saw what it did to that Type 95 tank, one shot, center hull, like a can opener. The weapon's debut was quiet, almost accidental. A handful of test units had been shipped to the Pacific in early May, tagged for limited evaluation. Marines assigned to them were told only that the weapon was experimental and that it could outshoot a bazooka by several football fields. They called it the no-kick gun. During the assault on Saipan's southern sector, Harkins' team set up the M18 behind a coral ridge. Japanese tanks were advancing along the beach road, lightly armored, fast, and dangerous to infantry pinned in sand. The Marines fired their first round from nearly 800 yards. The shell arced across the clearing, struck just above the driver's visor, and detonated inside. The tank halted mid-motion, smoke rising through the hatches. The second shot hit another vehicle farther down the line. The 13 Fighter Command's debriefing report for April, May 1944 included a brief mention. Ground units report high success with new recoilless type anti-tank gun, effective range observed at 900 yards against Japanese light armor. In Italy, that same month, soldiers of the 88th Infantry Division were testing their own M18s in the hills near Cassino. The terrain was steep, the air thin, and German armor appeared mostly in short bursts, self-propelled guns, half-tracks, Panzer IVs maneuvering between vineyards. Private First Class Raymond Sadowski described the scene in his field diary, later recovered by the U.S. Army Historical Division. "Two of us carried the rifle and the ammunition. It didn't slow us much. We fired from behind a stone wall. Rangefinder said 750 yards. The shell hit, turret came off. We didn't believe it at first. The weapon's mobility became its revelation. Unlike the bazooka, which required batteries and delicate rockets, the recoilless fired fixed rounds with simple mechanical reliability. A trained crew could fire 6 shots in a minute, adjust aim, and shift position before the enemy pinpointed the backblast." Captured German reports from the 71st Infantry Division, translated post-war by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, recorded growing concern. Enemy infantry has employed a new lightweight gun of unknown type, capable of penetrating frontal armor of Panzer IV from unusually great distance. On May 24, 1944, a German Panzergrenadier detachment near Anzio found the remains of an M18 in the rubble of a farmhouse. It was sent to the Heereswaffenamt, Army Ordnance Office, in Berlin for examination. The engineers there noted its simplicity with astonishment: a Venturi tube, rifled barrel, perforated cartridge case. "Ingeniously primitive," one officer wrote. The report concluded, "Effective range greatly exceeds our Faust Patron and Raketen Panzerbox. Recommend countermeasures include smoke cover and rapid flanking." But there was no practical countermeasure. The Panzerfaust's 200-meter envelope meant German infantry had to close with tanks. The M18 allowed American squads to stand off, invisible, and strike with impunity. Range, for the first time, belonged to the foot soldier. By the end of May, 150 minutes and 18 seconds had been distributed across Marine and Army units in both theaters. Field returns were uniformly enthusiastic. One Marine colonel compared its effect to putting artillery in a rifle company. In the Pacific, Japanese bunkers that once required 75mm pack howitzers could now be breached by a single recoilless shell. From the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's Pacific Annex came a line that captured the change: where once the machine gun ruled the infantry line, now the recoilless rifle dictates the fight. In the wreckage of Saipan's sugar mill district, Sergeant Harkins' men found the charred hull of the tank they had first destroyed. They photographed the hole, the twisted armor plate, and sent it with their after-action report. The image reached Washington in June. It was marked confidential, ordnance validation. The M18 had drawn its first blood. The Germans, still confident in their Panzerfaust's supremacy, had yet to understand what was coming. June 12, 1944, near Corentin, France. The hedgerows of Normandy were green traps, earth embankments lined with thick brush and trees, perfect cover for German armor. When the first M18 recoilless rifles arrived with elements of the 90th Infantry Division shortly after D-Day, they looked like curiosities beside the heavy bazookas. The men joked that they resembled oversized hunting rifles. But within days, their opinion would change, and so would the Germans. On June 10, as Sherman struggled against Panzer IVs near the village of Montmartin, Corporal Joseph Kettering and his three-man team set up their M18 behind a hedgerow breach. They had trained on it for only an hour aboard the landing ship that brought them ashore. The gun weighed just over 20 pounds, light enough to move with a rifle squad, and the ammunition came in cylindrical tubes marked 57mm Recoilless, M306. When a Panzer IV advanced into the lane, its commander confident of armor superiority, Kettering fired at 600 yards. The shell hit below the turret ring, where the frontal plate met the glacis. The tank stopped instantly, smoke pouring from the hatch. German infantry scattered. The Americans watched in disbelief. The weapon had worked far beyond bazooka range. That single engagement drew immediate attention. The after-action report from the 90th Division, filed June 12, 1944, stated, "New recoilless weapon exceeded expected penetration and range, complete destruction of Panzer IV at approximate 550 to 600 yards. No counterfire observed." The next day, 13 Corps requested additional weapons for frontline testing. By the week's end, 30 M18s were operating across the Cotentin Peninsula. They were deployed against light armor, trucks, and fortified positions. To every commander who saw it in action, the pattern was clear: American infantry had gained the ability to destroy tanks without calling for artillery or armor support. Captured German communications confirmed the growing unease. A translated message from the Panzerlehr Division dated June 14 read, "Enemy infantry employs light gun with heavy shell, range 600 to 800 meters, no recoil observed. Tanks destroyed by single hits. Not bazooka." The Heeresgruppe B Daily Intelligence Summary recorded similar confusion: "New American infantry weapon observed. Appears to be small cannon firing shaped charge shell. Backblast significant. Recommend countermeasures: avoid open lanes, engage at distance, smoke screening." But smoke was no protection against something that could strike from almost half a mile away. On June 15, near St. Lo, a German half-track column ran into an ambush set by the 357th Infantry Regiment. Two M18s fired from elevated positions, hitting the lead and rear vehicles. The rest were trapped in the lane, easy targets for rifle grenades and machine guns. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. The Germans, stunned by the long-range accuracy, later wrote in their battalion logbook, "Destroyed by invisible cannon, enemy infantry at great range." Back in Washington, ordnance engineers pored over field reports arriving via teletype. They noted that crews praised the M18's portability and accuracy but requested better optical sights and improved blast protection. Photographs from Normandy showing German tanks with clean penetration holes circulated through the War Department, labeled "Confidential, Operational Validation, European Theater." By late June, the Germans had captured a damaged M18 near Isigny. It was sent to the proving grounds at Kummersdorf for study. The report, recovered after the war, described its construction in detail: ingenious weapon. Employs vented cartridge case to offset recoil. Fired from bipod or shoulder. Extremely light, yet powerful. Capable of defeating 80mm armor at 600 meters. The conclusion was grim: infantry must not expose armor in open lanes within 700 meters of enemy foot soldiers. The Panzerfaust, the pride of the German Volksgrenadier, suddenly seemed primitive. Its range, barely 200 meters, meant German troops had to rush American tanks under fire. The recoilless rifle allowed Americans to do the opposite, stand off, unseen, and strike. An entry from the 2nd Panzer Division's War Diary, June 26, captured the shock and terse military prose: new U.S. anti-tank gun of light type, dangerous and accurate. Casualties high. Morale affected. The balance between infantry and armor had quietly shifted. While the world's attention focused on the beaches of Normandy and the air war overhead, a weapon scarcely longer than a rifle was rewriting ground combat doctrine. The M18 had shown that mobility and range, not thickness of armor, defined survival. By month's end, more than 100 confirmed tank kills in both theaters were credited to the recoilless rifle. The Germans had begun to call it der unsichtbare Kanone, the invisible cannon. And for the first time since 1940, Panzer crews realized that the front line belonged to the infantry again. September 1944, Aachen, Germany. By the time American forces reached the German border, the M18 recoilless rifle was no longer an experimental curiosity, it was doctrine. 13 Corps' August reports formally integrated recoilless rifle teams into each infantry battalion, usually 2 per company. Training manuals circulated through France in mimeographed form, stamped restricted, Itusa. The manual's first sentence was blunt: the M18 is a portable cannon designed to kill tanks. At first, the Germans refused to believe it. Reconnaissance reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division mentioned a small-caliber gun with disproportionate penetration, but senior officers dismissed it as an exaggeration. Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks had dominated short-range fighting since Kursk. The idea that the Americans could carry a lightweight cannon seemed absurd. But by September, disbelief turned into alarm. The Battle of Aachen, the first fight on German soil, showed how devastating the recoilless rifle could be in urban warfare. On September 16, as elements of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division pushed through the rubble-strewn streets of Verlottenheide, German Stu-G3 assault guns counterattacked from a side street. The narrow roads prevented Sherman tanks from maneuvering. Sergeant Albert Briscoe's M18 team set up in the 2nd floor of a wrecked hotel. They broke a window, braced the bipod on a table, and fired. The backblast shattered every pane in the building and scorched the wallpaper, but the round punched through the Stu-G's side armor and set it ablaze. The second shot caught the next vehicle in the drive sprocket. Briscoe's team destroyed 3 assault guns that morning. After-action photographs show the blackened Stu-Gs side by side in the intersection, hatches open, smoke curling from their interiors. One report from the 26th Infantry Regiment concluded simply, M18 highly effective in built-up areas. Backblast manageable with proper ventilation. German radio intercepts from Aachen reveal panic in the ranks. A message from the 9th Panzer Division to Army Group B read, "Enemy infantry employs light gun of high velocity, dangerous in street fighting. Our armor cannot advance without heavy mortar cover." The shock ran deeper than tactical loss, it was psychological. The Wehrmacht had long considered its armor the backbone of defense. The M18 turned that confidence into fear. Captured documents from the Aachen sector show frantic attempts to adapt. The Germans tried installing wire mesh and spare tracks on their tanks' flanks, hoping to disrupt the recoilless projectile-shaped charge. It made little difference. The 57mm shell, though small, struck with near-perfect energy transfer. American commanders noticed the shift. General Clarence Hubner, commanding the 1st Division, wrote in his operations summary, "Recoilless rifles have altered street combat. Enemy armor now hesitates to close. Infantry can advance independently." Meanwhile, ordnance engineers in the rear worked to expand production. Lockheed and Firestone plants in Akron, Ohio, began mass manufacturing barrels and vented cartridges. In September alone, 7,000 minutes and 18 seconds rolled off assembly lines. Each came with a serial logbook and instruction leaflet: keep clear of backblast. Muzzle clear of obstruction. Engage moving armor under 800 yards. At the same time, field reports highlighted a new problem: visibility. The enormous plume of dust and debris from firing often revealed a team's position. Units improvised by firing from rubble, sewers, and cellar windows, turning urban ruins into firing nests. German survivors later described the effect as ghost artillery. One infantry officer, interviewed in 1946, recalled, "You could hear nothing before the hit. Then, a flash from nowhere, and our half-track would be burning. We called it the silent cannon." In October, a captured German engineer from Panzergruppe West was interrogated near Liège. His testimony, recorded by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, summarized the Reich's growing despair. "Our Panzerfaust was good for 30 to 50 meters, maybe 100 if you were lucky. The American weapon killed us at 6 times that distance. We could not close. Our soldiers feared it more than artillery." Even Hitler received reports. A situation bulletin from the Oberkommando des Heers, dated October 5, 1944, noted, "New American anti-tank gun, portable and efficient, has appeared widely. Production must be significant. Recommend acceleration of counter-device." No counter-device ever came. By late autumn, the M18 had spread from France to Italy, Belgium, and the Pacific. Photographs from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team showed Japanese-American soldiers carrying the same lightweight tubes through the Vosges forests, their barrels blackened by backblast soot. The Germans, who once pioneered recoilless technology in secret before the war, now found themselves on the receiving end of its perfected form. As the leaves fell around the shattered walls of Aachen, tank crews began painting additional armor plates over their sides and carrying sandbags atop the engine decks. None of it stopped the invisible cannon. The lesson was written in steel and smoke: the age of the armored juggernaut was over. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. December 1944, the Ardennes, Belgium. Snow muffled the sound of engines, but not the echo of explosions. During the Battle of the Bulge, when the German army launched its last desperate offensive through the Ardennes, the M18 recoilless rifle proved itself not just a weapon of innovation, but of survival. Amid blizzards and chaos, small groups of American infantry halted the advance of tanks that had once rolled unstoppable across Europe. The M18 had been distributed widely by December. Each U.S. division in the 1st and 3rd Armies carried at least 50 of them. In the 99th Infantry Division's Weapons Company, Lieutenant Robert Endicott recorded in his logbook on December 17, "Recoilless rifles set up along Elsenborn Ridge. Expect armor thrust tonight. Snow heavy, visibility 100 yards." When dawn came, the panzers appeared, dark shapes gliding through fog. The German spearhead, including elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, believed American infantry could be brushed aside. Their scouts reported no tanks, no towed 57mm guns, only light infantry. But within minutes, that illusion died. At 400 yards, Endicott's team opened fire. The first round struck a Panther's lower hull and penetrated cleanly. A second hit disabled the following tank. The sound of the M18 was strange in the frozen air, a hollow crack, followed by the whistle of the vented gases. It was not thunderous, but sharp and surgical. The Germans were stunned. Infantry accompanying the armor dove for cover as the Panthers burned in the snow. A captured German radioman later told interrogators, "We thought at first it was an artillery shell from far away. Then another tank was hit, direct fire, close range. We could not see where it came from." The M18s along Elsenborn Ridge fired over 50 rounds that morning. American positions, though outnumbered, held. When the fog cleared, the ridge was littered with wrecks, Panzer IVs, half-tracks, and a Tiger II, its glacis punched through at 700 yards. The after-action report of the 99th Infantry Division, December 19, noted, "Weapon exceeded expectations, capable of defeating heavy armor under ideal conditions. No crew casualties from backblast reported." That entry circulated to headquarters in Spa and then to SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Eisenhower's staff underlined the phrase "defeating heavy armor" in red pencil. The Germans had unleashed their strongest armor, and the infantry, once considered defenseless, had stopped it with a 20-pound gun. Desperate to counter the new threat, German engineers rushed to modify their existing Panzerfaust design. The result was the Panzerfaust 150, with extended range and improved optics. But production chaos and Allied bombing crippled output. Fewer than 2,000 reached the front before the war's end. The Panzerfaust 150's theoretical range of 200 meters was still far short of the M18's 600-yard reach. Captured documents from the Heereswaffenamt, Army Ordnance Office, tell the story bluntly. One report from January 3, 1945, found in a destroyed staff car, read, "Enemy's recoilless gun renders infantry anti-tank defense obsolete. Our counter-design insufficient. Recommend concentration on mobile armor instead." Yet even armor could not hide forever. The Ardennes offensive dragged into January. Snow froze tank engines, and fuel ran dry. The U.S. Army's recoilless teams kept firing, now not only at armor, but at machine gun nests, fortified buildings, and supply trucks. The weapon had become an all-purpose equalizer. Private First Class Harold Kimball of the 2nd Infantry Division described it later, the bazooka was a door knocker. The recoilless was a cannon. We could hit a tank or a farmhouse a half-mile away and watch it crumble. As the German offensive collapsed, reconnaissance aircraft photographed columns of burnt-out tanks lining the forest roads near Malmedy and Stavelot. Intelligence officers overlaid those images with front-line positions of infantry companies armed with recoilless rifles. The correlation was unmistakable. Where the M18s had been deployed, German armor was stopped cold. When the snow melted in February, the U.S. Army conducted its first systematic evaluation of the M18 in combat. The 13 Corps Ordnance Board summarized. Weapon exceeded predicted penetration by 25%. Operational success against all known German armor types confirmed. Portable, low maintenance, high morale impact on infantry. The Germans, who had once regarded American foot soldiers as soft, now feared their unseen cannons. The recoilless rifle had broken not just armor but myth, the myth of invincibility that surrounded the Panzer divisions since Poland and France. From then on, German tank crews entered combat wary, scanning hedgerows and ruined buildings for the telltale flash of the M18. A captured lieutenant from the 1st SS Panzer Corps confessed during interrogation, "We no longer drove straight into battle. We crawled. Every shadow could hide that cursed gun." In the snows of the Ardennes, technology and endurance had fused into one cold truth: the German countermeasure had failed, and the tide of armored warfare had turned for good. April 1945, the Ruhr Pocket, Germany. The end of the war in Europe was measured not in miles, but in burned steel. The Ruhr Pocket, the final collapse of Germany's industrial heart, was a graveyard of armor. Hundreds of tanks, half-tracks, and self-propelled guns lay wrecked in fields and along cobblestone roads. Many bore the same kind of damage, a single, precise hole from a 57mm shell. The M18 recoilless rifle, by now in the hands of nearly every U.S. infantry division, had become the signature of defeat. By April, the weapon's legend preceded it. Civilians whispered about it in captured towns. German officers interrogated by the Allies referred to it as Das Rückstoßlos, the recoilless one, as if it were a phantom rather than a machine. For the Americans, it was no longer a novelty. It was a tool of inevitability. Sergeant Thomas Drummond of the 104th Infantry Division recalled that the gun felt like the last word in the argument. He and his crew had carried the same weapon from Normandy to the Rhine, painting small white rings around the muzzle for every confirmed tank kill, 5 by the end of the campaign. At Duisburg, their last engagement came against a column of retreating armored cars. They set up near a railway embankment, fired 3 rounds, and the convoy vanished in smoke and wreckage. It wasn't war anymore, Drummond later said. It was demolition. Captured German records from the Ruhr confirmed the psychological impact. One Wehrmacht field report from April 8 read, "Enemy infantry used light cannon with great accuracy. Our armored cars destroyed at long range. Men panic at sound." Another noted grimly, "Infantry morale deteriorating. Tanks refuse to advance without smoke cover." The M18's reputation outgrew its statistics. In truth, it was not invincible. It required careful aim, vulnerable to counterfire, and difficult to conceal after the first shot. But in the ruins of the Third Reich, where every engagement was a small, close-range ambush, its efficiency was unmatched. It allowed ordinary riflemen to act with the authority of artillery. In mid-April, American engineers attached to 19 Corps conducted impromptu demonstrations for newly liberated Allied units. They fired at captured German tanks, Panther, Tiger, Jagdpanzer. Observers recorded penetration results at ranges up to 750 yards. Every hit struck home. The report's summary, signed April 19, 1945, was clinical. Weapon has rendered medium armor obsolete as a decisive battlefield factor. Infantry now possess capability for self-contained anti-armor defense without external support. The Germans had come full circle. Before the war, they themselves had pioneered the first recoilless prototypes, Gerät 2101 and 2401, built by Rheinmetall in 1938. Hitler, unimpressed by their limited production value, had cancelled the program. 7 years later, that abandoned concept returned across the battlefield in perfected American form. When U.S. troops reached the Elbe River, they carried the M18 as naturally as a rifle. Photographs show men wading through the shallows near Magdeburg with the weapon slung across their backs, a symbol of an infantry that no longer feared armor. The myth of the tank, of unstoppable steel rolling over men, had died quietly in the mud. After Germany's surrender in May, Allied technical officers began collecting captured documents and equipment for post-war study. The Technical Intelligence Bulletin of June 1945 concluded: enemy anti-tank tactics collapsed before the combination of range and accuracy of U.S. recoilless rifles. Future warfare will require a reassessment of armor-to-weight ratios and emphasis on mobility over thickness. In other words, the world had reached the end of the Iron Age. The age of armor supremacy, of blitzkrieg and panzers, had lasted less than a decade. Its end came not through massive guns or heavy tanks, but through a light tube of steel and vented gas that a single soldier could carry on his shoulder. At Kummersdorf, Soviet investigators found the burned-out remains of a captured M18 prototype once tested by the Germans the previous year. It lay in the snow beside a wrecked Tiger, the two symbols of contrasting philosophies, brute force versus precision. A Russian colonel remarked, according to Allied notes, "This is the weapon of the future. The tank is the dinosaur." The Americans, too, understood. Within months, the Ordnance Department began scaling the concept upward: 75mm, 105mm, 120mm recoilless rifles, each building on the lessons of the M18. It had begun as an experiment, it ended as a revolution. As the war closed, the infantrymen who carried it home packed away their battered, soot-blackened tubes. Most would be scrapped or melted down. Yet among those who had fired it, the memory endured. The recoilless rifle had not just given them a weapon, it had given them equality against fear. And in that final spring of 1945, as the Reich crumbled and silence fell over Europe, the M18 stood as both symbol and sentence, the simple, light, and devastating answer to the myth of invincible steel. July 1945, Luzon, the Philippines. While Europe's cities smoldered in surrender, the war in the Pacific still burned. On Luzon, in the jungles north of Manila, the M18 recoilless rifle entered its second proving ground, a theater of ambushes, caves, and fanatical resistance. What had been a tank killer in France became a bunker breaker in the Pacific. Its lightweight and firepower made it the perfect weapon for the terrain the Japanese called Jigaku no Mori, the forest of hell. The 37th Infantry Division received its first shipment of M18s in April 1945. Lieutenant Donald Parks, a platoon leader near Balit Pass, recorded his impressions in a field notebook preserved by the U.S. Army Heritage Collection. Weapon performs superbly against pillboxes and caves. Backblast dangerous in confined spaces. Still, it does what no other gun can, it silences the mountain. In that campaign, the Japanese 4th Air Group and 10th Division had turned the Caraballo Mountains into a fortress. Every ridge bristled with machine guns, mortars, and dug-in bunkers reinforced with logs and rock. American bazookas could chip at them, flamethrowers worked only at suicidal range. The recoilless rifle changed the equation. On May 2, at kilometer post 165, a platoon of the 145th Infantry was pinned down by a bunker commanding the road. Corporal Vincent D'Ambrosio's M18 crew dragged their weapon uphill through bamboo thickets. They fired from behind a boulder, the backblast scorching ferns. The 57mm shell entered the bunker slit, detonating inside. When the smoke cleared, the position was silent. Infantry advanced without further resistance. A debriefing report from 13 Fighter Command noted, ground units report extraordinary success employing new recoilless weapon. Effect comparable to 75mm pack howitzer at fraction of weight. The Japanese defenders, accustomed to the slow arc of mortars and grenades, were stunned by the precision of direct fire explosions. A captured diary from a Japanese sergeant, translated by Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, Addis, on June 10, recorded, "The enemy has a small gun that fires without recoil. It strikes our bunkers from afar with one shot. Even the mountain trembles." The M18's tactical effect rippled across the islands. On Mindanao, the 24th Division employed them to collapse cave entrances where hundreds of Japanese troops hid. Engineers calculated that a single 57mm shell could dislodge more than a ton of rock. At Balit Pass, the recoilless rifles were used to fire white phosphorus rounds, flushing hidden defenders from ravines. The contrast between European and Pacific use fascinated ordnance officers. A memorandum from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, dated August 1, 1945, summarized. Weapon originally designed for anti-armor employment has demonstrated multi-role capability in jungle warfare. Effective against fortifications, cave systems, and entrenched infantry. Psychological impact severe, enemy perceives it as a form of portable artillery. Japanese prisoners consistently reported fear of the weapon's sudden precision. One officer from the 4th Air Group, interrogated in July 1945, said, "It seemed the Americans had artillery in every foxhole." Even as the war neared its end, the M18's influence spread to the planning rooms of invasion. Operation Downfall, the projected assault on the Japanese home islands, listed recoilless rifles, 57mm and 75mm, as standard issue for assault divisions. The logistical estimates projected 25,000 units for initial deployment. Then came Hiroshima. Then Nagasaki. The invasion never happened. But the weapon had already rewritten the doctrine that would have guided it. After the Japanese surrender in September, Army technical intelligence units gathered captured reports and artifacts across the Pacific. Among them was a Japanese technical sketch labeled Enemy 57mm No Recoil Cannon. The drawing was rough but recognizable, the same vented barrel, the same tripod, the same fear. In December 1945, during the U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Tokyo, former Japanese officers discussed post-war lessons. Colonel Naoto Ishiwara, who had studied German and American armaments before the war, commented, "We understood the tank. We did not understand the weapon that could erase it." He was referring to the M18. By year's end, the National World War II Museum archives show correspondence between U.S. Ordnance officers and Pacific veterans describing the weapon as the bridge between rifle and cannon. The final combat report from the Philippines summed it up simply, "With this gun, one man can do the work of 10. In the Pacific, the M18 had transcended its purpose. It was no longer just an anti-tank weapon, it was the instrument of the modern infantry. Its light, vented barrel had become the sound of American firepower distilled to its essence, precise, mobile, and relentless. When peace returned, the men who had carried it still remembered its sound, the breath of fire that had ended bunkers, tanks, and, symbolically, the age of fortresses. In the jungle silence after the war, one soldier wrote home, "We had a cannon that fit on our backs." The enemy called it magic. Maybe it was. 1946 to 1950, occupied Germany and beyond. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent, the M18 recoilless rifle did not vanish into obscurity. It remained, both physically and symbolically, a small miracle of American engineering, light enough to carry, strong enough to alter tactics, and startling enough to reshape foreign doctrine. In Germany's ruins, Allied occupation officers and captured Wehrmacht engineers came face to face with what they privately admitted was a weapon beyond imagination. In the winter of 1946, the U.S. Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence teams demonstrated the M18 to former German armament officers at the proving ground in Kummersdorf. Present were engineers from Rheinmetall and Mauser, men who had designed the Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck. Their reactions were immediate and candid. "It cannot be real," one engineer murmured as the small green tube fired, recoilless, across the snow. The round struck a derelict Panzer III Hulk and punched through its side plate cleanly. Colonel Edwin Baxter, who supervised the demonstration, recorded their remarks. German engineers were incredulous. They believed such a system impossible to mass-produce. Upon inspection, they conceded the principle, vented gases to balance recoil, was mechanically simple but industrially demanding. They lacked the alloys and machining tolerance for safe replication. That simplicity, the very thing that made the weapon revolutionary, was what Germany had missed. The Panzerfaust had been born of desperation, cheap tubes, disposable once fired. The M18 represented abundance, reusable, precise, standardized, made by a nation that could afford refinement even amid total war. Captured German technical reports, translated by the Allies in 1947, show attempts during late 1944 to create a recoilless Panzerabwehrkanone of similar design. Prototypes never progressed past bench trials. Metallurgical flaws caused ruptures, and the required propellant technology was out of reach under Allied bombing. The reports were signed by engineers who would later advise Soviet and American designers in the Cold War's early years. Indeed, the M18's legacy extended beyond its own steel and sights. It was the forerunner of a new age, the idea that mobility and firepower could coexist. By 1947, the U.S. Army was already testing larger variants, the 75mm and 105mm recoilless rifles, direct descendants of the M18's field success. Photographs from Aberdeen proving ground show soldiers smiling behind the vented barrels, firing shells that barely nudged them backward. The days of heavy-towed guns were numbered. The Soviets watched carefully. Documents from captured German archives, later opened by the Allies, reveal that Soviet ordnance officers examined M18 units in occupied territories as early as 1946. Within 4 years, the USSR fielded the B-10 and B-11 recoilless rifles, heavier, cruder, but unmistakably inspired by the American design. The arms race had absorbed another American innovation. Meanwhile, in the United States, the veterans who had carried the M18 wrote their own memories. Some described the weapon with affection, others with awe. Corporal D'Ambrosio, the same man who had used it to silence the Caraballo bunker in Luzon, summed it up best in a 1949 interview for Stars and Stripes: "You could carry it like a log and hit like a cannon. It made you feel like you had artillery in your hands." In post-war Germany, the old disbelief transformed into grudging respect. Military attaches from the nascent Bundeswehr studied the M18 during the early 1950s as part of NATO standardization. They noted its range, 450 meters effective against armor, and its weight, only 44 pounds. A German analyst wrote, "The Panzerfaust was born from scarcity. The M18 was born from confidence." That distinction, between invention born of survival and invention born of surplus, defined the new order of the world. The weapon also became a teaching tool. In lectures at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, instructors used the M18 as an example of technological democracy, a system so efficient that even its soldiers carried the precision of industry to the front lines. By 1950, the Korean War reintroduced the M18 to combat. Though newer recoilless rifles were replacing it, many M18s were reissued to infantry units. On Korean hillsides, it again knocked out bunkers and light armor, proving its timeless utility. In that continuity lay its final lesson. From Normandy to Luzon, from Okinawa to the frozen ridges of Korea, the M18 recoilless rifle had turned the infantryman into something new, a self-contained artilleryman. It embodied the idea that technology, multiplied by abundance, could neutralize even the heaviest armor. When German engineers first saw it, they had called it unmöglich. By 1950, every major army in the world was designing its own. The M18 was more than a weapon. It was the symbol of an industrial civilization's victory over mass and momentum, a 57mm echo of the world America built after 1945, light, fast, and devastatingly efficient. The war had ended, but its lesson remained etched in steel. Strength was no longer measured in tons, but in ingenuity. The recoilless rifle had proven that sometimes, the loudest statement of power was made by a weapon that didn't even kick back.